further ado, we're going to introduce one of our special issue editors, Anna Crasso, who will present. Anna, let me...
Thank you, Scott. My role, and I will not take the 10 or 15 minutes that you were offering, is really as an editor, and in this case not as an author, to have a very brief presentation of what the special issue is and which kind of topics is included there. So I'm not going to do a presentation about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I let this for the next speakers that will introduce you to all the details. But basically just a little bit of the trajectory of this special issue. So as you know, the title is How has the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam changed the legal, political, economic and scientific dynamics? This was launched just recently, is the volume 41 number 4, and is a special issue of the Water International, so an issue that is dedicated to a specific topic. A lot of people would ask, so why to have a journal or a special issue of a journal dedicated to the GERD? Basically, I think everybody working in the Nile Basin, but even outside of the Nile Basin, knows that this is an extremely timely topic for the basin and for transboundary water management in general. So for people that are interested in management of transboundary water resources. We also believe that there is an increasing need to bridge the science, so the kind of things that we do as academics and people working in think tanks, and to have a bridge to the policy and decision-making process. And we think that a journal on this issue, and that is just the first of what we hope many of a collection of articles on this topic, is the first journal issue exclusively dedicated to the topic. There was, of course, a great honor for us to be editing such a journal, but it was also a challenge in knowing how controversial the topic is, or the Grand Renaissance Dam itself and all the process, the political process involved in it. The two goals that we had, the first one is to understand how has the GERD changed the dynamics in the Nile Basin. Already this morning I mentioned that the changes that were already going on before the GERD, but that the GERD also comes to make it even more changing, contributing to the changing nature. And the second goal is to provide the readers with a critical analysis of the challenge and opportunities brought by the GERD. And in this case, we include several different topics, so we are not just looking at it from a technical point of view or legal point of view. We try to bring as many researchers as we could to over the several different topics. And just a very brief overview of the trajectory. The genesis of this special issue can be traced back to the World Water Congress in 2015 that was organized by the International Water Resources Association. The special issue involves 18 authors, so we have 7 articles and 1 editorial, but most of the articles are co-authors, so that's why we have 19 authors involving people from the 3 countries, or from the 3 countries on the GERD, on the Blue Nile, and plus others. All papers were peer reviewed by external experts. We have 3 on law, 2 on politics, and 2 more on the scientific and hydrology side perspective. These articles, and I think it's quite interesting and shows how much interest there is on this topic. Articles were made available from April, so the first one was by Professor Salman, who is going to give a talk just after me. That was the first one to be finalized and published, and most of the others were between May and June. And at the moment we already have thousands of downloads, so not all papers are open access, but the ones that are, I mean, for example, the one of Kevin Wheeler in less than 4 months or in less than 5 months has already around 2,500 downloads, which shows a lot. Was officially launched at the World Water Week in Stockholm in August 2016, and we did it on purpose to involve policymakers and civil society during the launching. I mean, people that have been reading the special issue and had an opinion about the value add that this special issue could bring. There is some possible offsprings. One is the policy brief that you mentioned, which is coming out soon. Perhaps a book dedicated to the topic and as well a special session in the next World Water Congress. Looking at the contents of the special issue, so we have the editorial by Zeray that was with us this morning, Alistair and myself. And then we have several different articles, which I'm going to mention very briefly what they are upon. I mean, this, my point with this presentation is to make this as a teaser so that people then will be interested to reading the articles and are going to download it and read it while doing, I don't know, other things perhaps. But we have 3 articles on the legal dynamics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we have both Salman and Marcella with us that will give us big insight on these issues, but that touch upon issues of legal instruments at the basin and regional level, principles of international law, substantive and procedural issues, and how the GERD process, I mean, what kind of legal changes does it bring? We had then 2 articles on the political and economic dynamics, my own and co-authored with Alan Nicol on the norms of cooperation. For those listening to us that have been this morning, I did a presentation on the main findings. I'm not going through it right now again. But the coexistence of the different cooperation process, there is a lot of talks about the opportunities, namely in terms of economic opportunities, but there is also the challenge and how this benefit sharing concept that everybody is using is being operationalized, or how can it be in case that is not. And we have with us today Ken, who is not part of the special issue. We would really have liked that he was part, but that can bring us an economic analysis, which is a research project that he has been involved in the last years, and we are really keen to listen more about his own conclusions regarding the GERD. And last but not least, the scientific dynamics. We had with us this morning Kevin, which is one of the authors, or the main authors of one of the papers, and we had another one as well, looking in particular at filling and long-term operations of the GERD, which is a major issue, not just in technical terms, but has political dimensions, possible coordination and adaptation strategies, and looking in particular the one from Paul Block at the natural flow and climate variability. And the question that is raised is, what is the appropriated solution that can increase the benefits for all the countries and decrease the risks, in particular for the downstream riparians? And the answer is that only cooperation can answer that question. The conclusion, and I would say that this is not a conclusion we can say that all the articles have arrived to this conclusion. No, these are main message that we can say that all the articles do agree, but not necessarily in the same terms, but that the GERD has not only changed the dynamics in the Nile Basin, but it has the potential to bring even more changes now for next year when the filling will start, and the next 10 or 15 years while the dam is being operated or the reservoir is being filled. This does not come without challenge. We know that this has a lot of different challenges, in particular at the political level and negotiation level. Ultimately, one of the main conclusions, and we can say that in that case all the articles strongly recommend that sub-basin and basin-wide cooperation as the solution not only to the issue or the collective issue of sharing the Nile waters, but also to support wider economic integration between the Nile riparians. And if nothing else, we think that the GERD process provides the strategic opportunity that countries and those interested in the Nile Basin reflect upon the need to have a new transboundary water regime which is acceptable, negotiated and accepted by all the countries. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I thought that was really good. That hopefully gave our audience members both an idea of what's in the special issue and the content and the different disciplines that we were able to touch on and bring together that cover the different aspects. that are important to the understanding the GERD question, but also I think gave us a bit of a theoretical background just to sort of see where this discussion is going to go today. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for mentioning our first webinar as well. If people are interested on some of the presentations, particularly Professor Wheeler's, that'll be available on the IWRA website soon. His PowerPoint presentation, hopefully the recording of the webinar, so you can go there and see what we talked about this morning as well. So let's go on to our next presenter, Professor Salman, Dr. Salman.
Do you have my presentation on the screen? You have it?
Not there. There you go. You should.
You have it?
Not yet. There it is.
Okay, so I can start now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, my name is Salman. I'm not a professor, just because I'm not affiliated with any university. So the title of my presentation, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which we will call the GERD during the presentation, a catalyst for cooperation on the Nile with a question mark. I'll start with a few factual facts about the GERD. It's the largest dam in Africa and the 10th in the world. That's when it's completed. It is located on the Blue Nile, about 20 kilometers from Sudanese border. I'll just show a map where it shows the location of the Grand Renaissance Dam with regard to Sudan. And this is a map of the Nile basin, so you can have a better idea of where it fits within the Nile basin as a whole. It's a large dam, the height of 145 meters. The reservoir capacity is about 74 billion cubic meters. That's about twice the size of Lake Tana, where the Blue Nile emerged, and it's about half the size of the reservoir of the Aswan High Dam, which is about 162 billion cubic meters. The installed capacity for electricity is about 5,000 megawatts. There are 16 turbines, each with 375 megawatts. The cost of the project is estimated as $4.8 billion, close to $5 billion. The construction of the dam is being carried out by Salini, the Italian company. Turbines are provided by Alstom and Siemens, a Swiss-German combination of companies. And the power lines are being built by the Chinese. So it's a large consortium of participants. The status of the GERD as of this year, close or about 60% is complete. It's on schedule and it's poised for completion on time next year, exactly about a year from now. The project has been vehemently rejected by Egypt when it was announced in 2011. The rejection of the GERD continued through 2014, and then things start changing in 2015. We'll come to that in a minute. Sudan also initially rejected the project, but then there was a gradual acceptance, and the final acceptance came in 2013. We'll come to that in a minute. But however, the project was finally accepted by both Egypt and Sudan in December 2015, about a year ago. In March 2015, about a year and a half ago, and that was through two legal instruments. The first one of them is called the Agreement on Declaration of Principles on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which was signed on March 23rd, 2015, about a year and a half ago. And the second document, which reconfirmed the acceptance of Sudan and Egypt, was called Khartoum Document, and it was signed in December last year, it's about a year ago. And the question that I'm trying to answer in the next few minutes left for me, can we consider this the beginning of an era of cooperation in the Nile Basin, the acceptance by Sudan and Egypt of the GERD and the signing of two legal instruments? And that's a question I'll try to answer in the next 5 or 6 minutes. This is the GERD in 2014, and this is the GERD May this year. And as I said, it's poised for completion in a year from now. I will start with the position of Sudan, and the title of the slides, the three coming slides, is the GERD, Ethiopia, and Sudan. I'm starting with the general observation that the project has the dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, has proven as a catalyst and the beginning of an era of cooperation between Ethiopia and Sudan. This is just in relation to Sudan and Ethiopia, because the Sudan realized that there are a number of benefits to be accrued from the dam. First, the dam will entrap large sediments that cross from the Ethiopian plateau into Sudan. Those sediments have caused the Rieu-Clarke Dam and the Swan and the Sennar Dam to lose more than 50% of the storage capacity and of the power generation capacity through the years. So now those sediments will be trapped inside Ethiopia, and Sudan doesn't have to worry a lot about much of those sediments. It will also end the floods that keep doing a lot of destruction in the downstream in the Blue Nile, in the Sinjar area. It will also help regulate the flow of the Nile throughout the year. Currently, the flow of the Nile, of the Blue Nile, is concentrated on the 4 months of June, July, August, and September. About 70% of the flow of the Blue Nile comes on those 4 months, and the remaining 8 months we have about 25%. So the dam will regulate the flow throughout the year. This will result in increased crop rotations. Rather than just have one crop rotation in July, August, September, Sudan can have 2, perhaps even 3 crop rotations. It will also help in the replenishment of groundwater throughout the year. Currently, the groundwater is only replenished during those 4 months, June, July, August, September. And by February, March, the Blue Nile starts even taking some water from the surrounding groundwater. Now, the groundwater will be replenished throughout the year. In the area of wilderness navigation, this will continue throughout the year because the river will have an average flow rather than high and low flow. There is also the sale of power generated by the GERD to Sudan, and there is also the possibility of water storage for Sudan. Sudan is now one of the lowest countries in the world with regards to water storage. It has less than 10 billion cubic meters stored in its 4 dams, Merowe, Sennar, Osiris, and Khashmir Girba. Sudan can easily negotiate storing some of the waters in the dam. Sudan wavered at the beginning. Wavered meaning didn't make a decision, or there were conflicting voices. Some of them saying the dam is good for Sudan, others saying no, the dam is bad for Sudan and we shouldn't support it. So there was wavering between the year 2011 and 2013. And one reason was the close ties that the Sudan has with Egypt, especially on the Nile waters. The 2 countries signed the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement, where they divided the entire flow of the Nile between them, 84 billion, 10 go for evaporation, and the remaining 74 was divided 55.5 for Egypt and 18.5 for Sudan, leaving nothing for the others. They established a joint permanent technical committee called the Permanent Joint Technical Committee, headquartered in Khartoum, to coordinate their work on the Nile and their position vis-a-vis the other Nile riparian demands. And the Permanent Joint Technical Committee is really the spokesman and the negotiator of the 2 countries. So as a result, one can conclude that the 1959 agreement really created an alliance between the 2 countries, and this alliance has been a very strong alliance. Their position has been the same and unified, and this showed up during the negotiations for the Cooperative Framework Agreement. The 2 countries just stuck together, and they're talking with the same language, and they took the same position on the Cooperative Framework Agreement, the NTB agreement, and both of them withdrew from the negotiations and refused to sign or to accede to the CFA. However, in addition to the benefits, there were some concerns about the dam safety and the period of filling of the reservoir, but those were addressed by the Declaration of Principles. So the GERD resulted in a major crack in the Ethiopian-Sudan alliance. Sudan formally supported the GERD in December 2013 through an announcement by the president himself. Since the announcement was made by the president, that closed the door for conflicting and statements by different ministries and ministers. No more conflicting ministers, because the president himself said that the GERD is good for Sudan. And the same month, December 2013, Sudan started buying electricity from Ethiopia. Started with 100 megawatt, and it has reached 250 megawatt now. And this is even before the GERD is completed. So Ethiopia played this card very well because they provide electricity to Sudan even before the GERD is completed, basically telling Sudan, look, this is what you can get now. Imagine what you can get when the GERD is completed. So there is more the purchase of more power is expected. And that was made easier by the power connection lines between Sudan and Ethiopia. And fortunately for Sudan and Ethiopia, they didn't have to worry about that line because it was financed under the Nile Basin Initiative Trust Fund. And the money came as a grant from the World Bank and some other donors. The only concern for them now is they need to strengthen the connection lines to convey more electricity. So Sudan supported the dam, and it is reaping the benefits of its cooperation with Egypt through the power that is getting now, and it is helping Sudan close a good part of the gap and the deficit in the power. This support was confirmed in December, in March 23rd, 2015, when Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia signed the Declaration of Principles, and this was reconfirmed in the Khartoum document. So my conclusion is with regard to Sudan and Ethiopia that yes, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has really heralded the beginning of an era of cooperation between Sudan and Ethiopia, but only between Sudan and Ethiopia. With regards to relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia and Egypt, as I said, Egypt initially opposed the GERD vehemently, but the problem is that Egypt had limited options. Ethiopia chose an excellent timing of the GERD, March 2011, when Egypt was engulfed and immersed in the revolution that toppled Hosni Mubarak. There was unrest in Egypt through the years 2011, 2014. The first year there was a transitional government, a weak transitional government, and then it was followed by the election which brought the Islamists, and then the problems between the Islamists and the secular elements. So that all turmoil in Egypt helped Ethiopia. So time was clearly on the side of Ethiopia. The second reason that helped Ethiopia was its ability to finance the dam from its own resources, 4.8 billion. Egypt has put a heavy bet on Ethiopia not being able to get the financing of the dam from outside, and will not be able to finance it from its own resources, being a poor country. However, Ethiopia was able to raise the funds through the bonds issued to Ethiopian nationals and non-nationals, and through its own resources. And that helped Ethiopia a lot because Egypt had strong diplomatic muscles which would have stopped the World Bank and the other donors from providing any funding to the project. Egypt threatened in 2013 of using force to stop the dam. That is the famous meeting which was headed by President Morsi, as you can see on the screen, with the government and opposition, and there was talk about attacking the dam and using the rebel groups within Ethiopia to attack the dam. Of course, that didn't come through, and it proved as an embarrassment to Egypt. That threat became an embarrassment to Egypt. So Ethiopia was also able to garner support for the GERD from the Nile Basin countries, African countries, and from European countries. Italy is building the dam. France, Switzerland, and Germany are providing the mechanical equipment, and China is providing support for building the power lines. And then came the major breakthrough for Egypt, as I said, which is the support of Sudan to the GERD, which weakened the Egypt stance. Egypt now had to stand alone on opposing the GERD, and this created a major crack on the Nile alliance between Sudan and Egypt. And the other reason, which Anna referred to in her talk about the new realities in the Nile Basin, that is Ethiopia is gradually emerging as a regional power. That also helped Ethiopia in moving forward with the dam. So the question now is will the dam herald an era of cooperation between Ethiopia and Egypt? And I would say that we have to look at more facts. The GERD has become a reality in 2015 and 2016. About 60% is complete. Sudan has supported the GERD. Other Nile countries have supported the GERD. And as I mentioned, Europe and China are helping with the GERD. And there has been no support, no direct support from the Arab countries to Egypt on its stance. So, and then the Declaration of Principles really dealt with cooperation in limited ways. Yes, Egypt and Sudan did recognize, did support, did agree to the GERD being built and completed, but there isn't much of cooperation in the agreement itself. There is no obligation for sale and purchase of the GERD power between the parties. One would have expected the agreement to say that, oh, Ethiopia agrees to sell Sudan and Egypt so much from the power, and that they will start negotiating right away and conclude the negotiation by a certain date. No, It only says that priority will be given to downstream riparians, a very vague term which puts no obligation on Ethiopia to sell electricity to Sudan and Egypt, and puts no obligation on Sudan and Egypt to buy electricity from Ethiopia. And there is talk about coordination and operation of the GERD with downstream reservoir, which I expect my colleagues who are speaking in this in the website webinar to talk more about it. But this is the only area where there is some specific kind of action, but still not very specific. There aren't any explicit action about putting a committee together and looking at this and that. Says no, there will be coordination on operation of the GERD with the downstream reservoir, but that's all. So as far as the relationship between Ethiopia and Egypt, I'll come to the conclusion and mention it in a minute. I would say that the GERD has proven a major catalyst for cooperation between Ethiopia and Sudan. There are realization of more benefits, major benefits accruing to Sudan, including the sale of power. With regards to Ethiopia and Egypt, I would say the result is more of a leveling of playing fields than cooperation. Now, Egypt has accepted Ethiopia as an equal partner in the Nile, as someone who has rights to the Nile, but it hasn't gone, the agreements and the statements haven't gone enough to really lead one to say that those statements and agreements are heralding an era of cooperation. The suspicion and mistrust is still over the relationship between the two countries, between Ethiopia and Egypt. And the recent accusation of Ethiopia to Egypt that it was supporting the unrest of the Oromo and the Amhara last month overshadowed the prospects of cooperation under the Declaration of Principles. And as I mentioned, the Declaration of Principles does not include specific areas of cooperation. So my conclusion is that cooperation between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Nile is now possible, given that the playing fields have been leveled, but it's possible more than ever before. But there is still a long way that the two countries need to go before they can reach and conclude concrete actions that would convey and translate cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I think you sold yourself a little short when you said that you weren't connected to any university or anything. It was obviously expert level of opinions, not just a man off the street. So we appreciate how that framing, based on your long experience with the Nile and with the GERD, really brings on kind of the geopolitical approach. Now we're going to hear from Kenneth, Marc, Strzepek, and get a different perspective. And there we go.
Good afternoon. And are you able to see the screen, Scott?
Looks beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. So I have some overlap slides I will go through. Just to give a little background, I've been working on the Nile since 1977 and was working extensively with Egypt. Then after the High Aswan Dam was going into operation and then have been working with the Nile Basin Initiative for the last 11 years on activities there. I'm water resource engineer, and you've seen this picture before of the Nile, and I'm just going to point out a couple things for you to go on with the wonderful presentation of Salman. What we see is there are some key issues for Egypt here. And we will probably focus a little bit today on looking at what are the potential impacts to Egypt. Will be sort of the framing of this in that context. And then we'll look at some of the engineering side, and then we're going to look at what does it mean economically, because there has been a mantra in the NBI, shared benefits, not shared water, because there is no win-win in water. It is a zero-sum game in the basin. So how do we share those? So the key thing here is you're seeing the wonderful link at Khartoum, and Khartoum is where the White Nile, which comes from the equatorial lakes, and you see in the lower left-hand side what's called the hydrograph, and that's where the flow of the Nile is coming from the Sudanese, now South Sudan, the Sud swamp, one of the largest wetlands in the world, environmentally sensitive. But what happens there is basically all the water from Uganda and the equatorial lakes evaporates there, and then the water that falls on the Sud, that travels forth and provides about 25 units of water coming out of the Sud into what's known as the White Nile. And it's called white because there's very little sediment. And then that joins the Blue Nile, which is here on the right-hand side, and that rises from Ethiopia, and you see Lake Tana that Salman mentioned, and that provides at the border about 48 units of water. Then with the Dindar and the Rashid, we get about 50 entering Khartoum. So at Khartoum, we have 25 to 26 coming from the White Nile, and then 50 coming from the Blue Nile. And then you see the other arrow up there, the Atbara, and the Atbara is coming from Ethiopia and a little bit from Eritrea, but mostly from Ethiopia, and that provides about 12 units. So at that point too, there's about 90 to 92 units of water, and then by the time it gets to Dongola, which is right before it enters Lake Nassa, it's estimated to be at 84 billion cubic meters of water. And then that we will see in a minute. But so the key thing here is that the White Nile is a steady flow over the year as well as from year to year. It's very steady. Where the Blue Nile, as we heard, 70% of its water comes in 3 months of the year, and it's very peaky. And then you see in the Atbara, all of its water comes in 5 months of the year, and then it is dry. So there is this large, as people say, drinking from a fire hose water coming down to the basins there. So just historically, which we got to 1959, there were a number of treaties made by Great Britain as Protectorate of Sudan and Egypt, and then as a colonist in the basin that basically cut Ethiopia out of using any of the Nile water, leading finally to the 59 agreement. And here are numbers to what Salman had said. But one of the key things for Egypt is, if you look in this column, is that Sudan and Egypt divided the Nile as 84, 10 for losses from Lake Nassa was 74 available for the two countries, and that was divided as 55.5 and 18.5 to Sudan. But Sudan, because it does not have a lot of good sites for reservoirs, never was able to develop the full complement of its water, which is now moving on. So Egypt had the benefits from 1970 till maybe 2010, for almost 40 years, of getting the excess water that Sudan did not take. So a rough estimate, these numbers are very difficult to find out, and each government has different numbers on them. Egypt has been getting probably 12 to 13% more water for over 40 years and has learned to use that. And Sudan has the right to develop up to 12.5. I mean, they have 12.5. They have the right under the 59 agreement to go to 18.5, and they're working on developing those things. You've heard again about the GERD, and then one of the things that is true about it is not going to irrigate. It is just going to be hydropower. And that's really important because it reflects on how it's going to operate. Many people say they're going to dry up the Blue Nile. No, they're not. What they're going to do is they want to fill it, and that's the point. What you see here is the schematic is the Blue Nile is flowing out of Egypt. It will be stored at the GERD, and it's going to dramatically change this picture up here, which we call the hydrograph, which is the average annual flow of the water arriving at Aswan, where we see the White Nile is the base on the bottom, and then the large spike, which we call the monsoon flow of the Blue Nile, and then the other portion from Ethiopia, which is the river Atbara. And so what will happen when the GERD is there, they will release this water for hydropower to make it very flat over the year. So once it's full, it will change the dynamics of Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia will want to release that water to produce energy in as constant a manner as they can. What that means now is that Sudan in the future, and we won't focus on that, we're going to focus on filling, but in the future, Sudan has the potential, with water being now stored at the GERD, to have multiple croppings. Right now, because you see this large slug of water, they're only able to irrigate major crops once a year. But if they have, because they cannot store it in Sennar and Rosaries in their dams, if it's stored at the GERD, and even if it's not they're storing it, but it's released for hydropower, they will be able to have multiple cropping seasons. And there is the potential, they have promised that they wouldn't go above the 18, but some studies that have been done say there's potential to irrigate using up to 25 or 26 or potentially even more of the water. So that they have said they will agree to the Nile, to the 59 agreement, but that alone would reduce the water going to Egypt as well. So this is one of the dynamics that's happened in the long term, is that the GERD changes the ability of Sudan to use and consume the Nile, Blue Nile waters, where Ethiopia is not going to want to do it. Now I want to quickly show you something about hydropower, and in the lower left-hand corner is the historical pattern of the level of Lake Nassa behind the High Aswan Dam, and that's a picture of its hydropower plant on the left and the dams on the right, and we see that the level changes over time as there is the natural variability of particularly the Blue Nile going into Egypt. So water resource management, and the reason this is important is hydropower, which is the energy you'll get out of the falling water, is a result of not only the flow that's going, but what's called the head, and that's the amount the water falls. So you want to keep your reservoir as full as you can so that you'll get more energy. So it is in the sense of the GERD, they would like to have that water as high as they can and then let all the water that would come go through and produce electricity that would go through. One of the things that people have estimated, and there's a few papers on it, is the 6,000 megawatts is probably oversized from an economic point of view, and unless you're doing it for peaking, which there's still not that peaking demand in the system, but maybe in the future it would not be used in that sense. This is a cross-section of the GERD Dam, and what's there is to show you is that you cannot operate your power, your penstocks or your turbines unless you have a certain minimum level of water here, which is at 590, and that means a minimum amount of water of 15 billion cubic meters needs to be in the reservoir at all time to generate a 1 kilowatt. So what it also means is when the dam is chosen to turn on, they have to fill it to at least 15 billion cubic meters to start getting operation, and then you can go all the way up to 640, and that's where the full amount is there. So the issue that's facing the countries right now in a technical sense is there have been all of these declarations of principles, but there's a term we use, the devil's in the details, and both sides technically have not agreed on how to fill the dam, because how they fill the dam will impact both Sudan and Egypt. And so the question is, what is that filling? Because both sides have agreed to no harm or no significant harm, and these adjectives become very, very important, and we'll probably hear about those later. So the question is there harm? And I'm showing you 4 different filling policies. One is fill it as quick as you can. One's fill it over 3 years, fill it over 5 years, or fill it over 10 years. But if you slow down the filling, you slow down the energy that's generated, and then you get less income back. And Ethiopia is paying somewhere on the order of $5 billion. So they need to start paying back those loans, which are to their people as well as to others in getting the revenue from this. So they want to fill this as rapidly as they can so they can start producing it. However, if you fill it rapidly, that is going to have problems downstream to Egypt. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit, is as they go to look and make a plan, we don't know what the future flows are going to be in the next 20 years or just even the 10 as we look at filling. And so we have to use technique. So what's interesting, this is really an extension of the special issue. Both Kevin Wheeler and Paul Block, we are using their tools that they developed for looking at stochastic or uncertain flows, and we are looking at what could happen from an economic point of view if we have this variability of flow, because what it does, it leads to a risky situation. So what this is showing is something known as a box and whisker, which reflects uncertainty, where those are the tails or the full range of the models of the uncertainty, and those boxes are 50% of the uncertainty, and that red line is what's known as the median. So what you see is in the GERD, if there's no policy, fill it as fast as you can, then the GERD over the first 10 years will fill rapidly. If you slow it over 10 years, the average volume will be 20 billion in the dam, and that will lead to significantly lower hydropower, which we will discuss in a minute. So these are the releases that would go downstream under these different policies, and the thing to look at is if there was no GERD at all and it was just natural flows, we're going to have the natural variability of the Nile, which is very high. That's what we would see, and as we start building a dam, we will limit some of that variability. You see the range is cut down somewhat, but as we fill it, we'll change the releases that go downstream. And what does that mean for Egypt? Now, in terms of these flows downstream, this will change the inflows to Egypt, but there is also the Atbara River giving 12 and the White Nile giving 22, so we have to look at that variability at the same time. So the Blue Nile is about 70% or so of the flow to Egypt, so we have to look at both of those together. So when we look at this, it will have impact on the storage at the High Aswan Dam, and so again, that will affect the hydropower out of the High Aswan Dam, as well as it goes down, it may get into, under some of these scenarios, their drought storage systems, which would reduce the flows to irrigation. So these are the impacts, and again, in the ranges of hydropower. And so what if Ethiopia were to slow its filling? What would that look like? And so here is the impact on the hydro generation, and you see the slower it fills, the less hydropower that they will generate, and this is still under the uncertainty. So we still don't know what the flows, so we have to look at it statistically and then from a risk point of view. So there is a trade-off of, as Ethiopia were to slow the filling, it would lose its hydropower that it's generating, but have less of an impact on Egypt. In the policies we're looking at here, there is a minimum flow of what we call the 20% average flow of the Aswan, of the Blue Nile, which is 30 billion cubic meters per year. And if you look at the paper by Kevin Wheeler et al., they looked at various levels. We cannot talk about that today, but we're looking at one of the lower ranges of having a minimum of 30 billion cubic meters released from the Blue Nile every year. So what happens is the GERD can produce almost 11,000 gigawatt hours of hydropower. If that has a revenue of 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and recently on the spot market, Kenya has been buying it at 14 cents per kilowatt hour. This would lead to annual revenues about 1.1 billion that would go into the economy and would have a slight multiplier effect, but we'll be conservative and say 1.5 million. So as we look at this, what we did is, what does this mean for Egypt? So the big thing we have to do is we use what's called a computable general equilibrium model that looks at how water fits into the economy of Egypt. And when the Aswan Dam was first built, the High Aswan Dam produced 50% of all of the energy generated in Egypt, and the agricultural part of the GDP was over 50%. But as of today, the energy from the High Aswan Dam is less than 10% because of the population growth and the addition of fossil fuel power plants, and GDP from ag is less than about 9%. So the importance of agriculture, the importance of hydropower has been reducing dramatically in the economy. So what this means is we look at that variation of inflows that had significant impacts in terms of physical numbers and engineering numbers. We then go look at this in terms of hydropower, and what do we see? We see that the average loss at the Hayaswan Dam is 1,480 gigawatt hours per year. And what does that translate to? Well, that means they would have to buy electricity from fossil fuel, import more fuel in the short term, and then they would potentially have, in this case, reducing some of their irrigation water. So that would mean losses to the irrigation sector or to the ag sector. And what does that add up to? And it adds up to less than 0.1% of GDP. Not 1%, but 0.1% at the maximum. And what does that mean in terms of money? So the loss for Egypt on the mean is, if they fill it as quick as they can, would be $117 million per year for 3 years. Under 2 years, under the 3-year fill, it would be 58, and under the 5-year fill, it would be 55 per year. But if we get the 5%, we have a risk of 5% chance that we'll get low flows over the next 10 years. So the unconstrained would take a long time to fill, and there we'd have a damage of up to $350 million per year. So there is some significant in absolute amounts, even though it may be percentage-wise not great, impacts on Egypt's economy of the GERD during the filling. After the filling, there is great opportunity for cooperation. But to get Ethiopia to benefit from the dam, they have to fill it. And that filling is taking water that would have gone downstream to Sudan or to Egypt, and that has a cost. Now, what does that mean for Ethiopia? Well, their benefits per year are estimated, depending on if they can sell all the dam, sell all the electricity of that, on the order of $1.2 billion on average. And as they slow the filling, it can drop down to about 1.1. But in terms of the 5% lower limit, they have a risk of only having about 1 billion, and then under the 3 and 5 years, it's limited at 9,500 or 950 because of the minimum flow releases. So there are going to be impacts. So there is the problem that we have for Egypt is why it may be small in terms of total economy, it's going to impact the farmers and low-income wages. That's one of the things that the model shows. The farmers would be impacted in their income. And in Egypt, the role of the Nile is extremely high.
Comments, if you could. We want to leave enough time for audience questions, if you could.
Okay, good. That was the last slide.
Excellent. Good. Well, I appreciate that. That was an interesting and different approach than we've had from any of our other presenters. So hopefully, if there's any questions regarding those last slides, people can go ahead and ask them, and we can kind of touch back to them, and I appreciate that. I do want to ask my following two presenters, 10 minutes should please rest closer to 10 minutes if you could. I don't want to cut you off midstream. I hate doing that to anybody, but at the same time, we do have to kind of move through these at a certain level of speed to get to some time with the questions at the end. Our next presenter is going to be Jasmine Mustafa.
Can you see my slides?
Not yet. How about?
No.
Yes. Now. That looks good.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this, and thank you to the previous two panelists. Their talks have been very thought-provoking, and I talked this morning about the legal framework governing the GERD, and so I'm going to try not to repeat what I said. There's just a few things that I want to highlight, but there's already a great deal of stuff that has been said by particularly Dr. Salman, so I'm going to try not to be repetitive. But I just want to clarify that in terms of the title of this presentation or this panel, I also wanted to emphasize the importance of that question mark at the end of a catalyst for cooperation. And the reason I emphasize that is because, as I said this morning, there's really very varied views when it comes to the GERD, and it is quite a controversial subject. So it is in no way unanimous that that the impacts of the GERD are necessarily to increase cooperation, and it really depends on how we define cooperation. And I said earlier this morning that while there might be a process of cooperation that is happening in terms of the leaders of the three countries getting together and issuing statements and signing documents, but it seems that on the ground, what is actually happening is quite some disregard for the cooperative process. So essentially, the GERD started off as a unilateral measure, and the GERD has been proceeding at a very rapid pace. And because it's proceeding at such a rapid pace, it means that the parties have agreed to have particular studies, and these studies have been outsourced to particular firms, and basically the pace of construction is really kind of outrunning the studies. So that's a real concern, and that's essentially what I want to talk about in my presentation. So it's not, the question is not whether or not Ethiopia has the right to construct dams on the Nile or to generate hydropower. Clearly the answer is yes. So there is a right to the equitable and reasonable use of of a transboundary watercourse, and that right belongs to each and every state along the watercourse. And I think before the GERD, and ever since the initiation of the NBI, there have been a lot of proposals that have been put forward for dams in Sudan and in Ethiopia, and a lot of them were approved cooperatively between the concerned states. So it's not an issue of whether or not Ethiopia can generate hydropower or whether or not Ethiopia can construct a dam. The question really is, what constraints does international law place on this process? So what I've put down here is a few, kind of to highlight a few events on the timeline. January 2011, the initiation of construction of the dam. May 2013, the International Panel of Experts report comes out, and the IPOE was an initiative from Ethiopia to start a consultative process. They requested additional studies. December 2014, the parties agreed to hire international firms, but the contracts are only signed last September. In March 2015, there's the Declaration of Principles on the GERD. And Article 5 of the Declaration of Principles clearly states that there is an obligation to respect the outcome of the joint studies and to implement the outcome of these studies. So what we have here really is a process that has created a series of obligations. So there are obligations that are substantive and there are obligations that are procedural. And under the Declaration of Principles, the substantive obligations, rights and obligations, are equitable and reasonable use and no significant harm. And then the procedural obligation, as embodied in Article 5, is basically to start off with the outcomes of the studies, to respect and implement them throughout the various phases of the project, but also to come up with a rule on first filling and then to use that rule on first filling to fill the dam. So not abiding by that particular process can easily be seen to amount to non-compliance with these procedural obligations. Now, I talked this morning about why the Declaration of Principles is binding under international law. I won't talk about that now. Now I actually want to talk about another thing. So I want to talk about Ethiopia's rights and obligations under customary international law. So again, I want to emphasize that specifically I'm talking about the GERD. I'm examining the GERD, not the right to... Hello?
And the inner onion ring is what is called the leadership group. So AFBB is going to be part of that inner ring. Yeah? AFBB, World Bank, AUC, and ECA. Yeah?
Hello?
And then the outer ring now where, based on how we evolve, we engage other partners into it.
That is mute that for me, please.
Special consultants based on our different areas of interest and what we see.
I'm sorry?
Oh, okay, we took care of that. Jasmine, can we take a second there to ask you to make your PowerPoint full screen?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just showing us the
I just wanted to find out what was happening.
no problem at all.
Okay.
We took care of that little noise distraction there, and we'll take care of this at the same time. Please continue. That was really
Okay, wonderful. Okay, excuse me for that. So, so as I said, I'm talking specifically about the GERD and not dams in general. So the GERD, the design of GERD, its size, its height, its reserve capacity, reservoir capacity, the pace of construction, etc. So all these issues related to the GERD, are there any limitations on them under international law or not? Or does Ethiopia have an unfettered right, because it has a right to equitable and reasonable use, to basically construct this dam according to whatever specifications it chooses? So I am specifically going to talk about customary international law, and I'm just going to give a brief overview. So I'm sure a lot of people in the audience already know about the basics of the law of non-navigational uses of international water courses. So what we have are two basic principles, the principle of equitable and reasonable use and the principle of no significant harm. And these two principles they pull in different directions. So the principle of equitable and reasonable use suggests, as I said before, all states on a water course have equality of right. No state has a privileged position simply or any advantage over any other state. Every state has the right to develop new uses of a water course, but at the same time they have to take into consideration not to cause significant harm to the interest of other states. So if we unpack these two principles, the critique is that they are quite vague and quite indeterminate, and they don't really give us a clear guidance as to how we are to discern the obligations of the parties. So if we are to unpack them, Article 7 of the UN Water Courses Convention, and I give this just as a guidance because I have to make a clarification here that the UN Water Courses Convention does not have a very large number of signatories. However, it is generally recognized that both Article 5 and Article 7 reflect customary international law. So Article 7 talks about no significant harm, and it's widely considered to reflect customary international law. But I would submit that the relationship between the two principles, equitable and reasonable use and no harm, under the convention does not reflect customary international law. And I won't talk about that now. Maybe I'll get to it a little bit later on. So under Article 7 UNWC, this is what it says: water course states shall take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of significant harm to other water course states. And then paragraph 2 says, where significant harm nevertheless is caused to another water course state, the state shall take all appropriate measures having due regard for the provisions of Articles 5 and 6 in consultation with the affected state to eliminate or mitigate such harm, and where appropriate to discuss compensation. So here we're talking about essentially two scenarios. So the first scenario is that a state, in utilizing an international water course, takes all appropriate measures. Now that's clearly a due diligence obligation, and this is the requirement that the convention places to take all appropriate measures. So it's an obligation of conduct and not an obligation of result. And then under paragraph 2, we're talking about where a state has taken these appropriate measures, harm nonetheless occurs. In that case, then it must enter into consultations and take all appropriate measures to eliminate or mitigate that harm with due regard to Articles 5 and 6. Now, Article 7 does not deal with the situation where a state does not take all appropriate measures to avoid causing harm, where a state does not meet its due diligence obligations. Now, it could be argued very plausibly that not waiting for the outcome of the studies, not waiting for an adequate environmental impact assessment and other types of studies on the impact of the GERD, that they don't meet that doesn't meet the due diligence obligation under Article 7. Now, when you look at Article 5 of the UN Water Courses Convention, it stipulates that water course states shall, in the respective territories, utilize an international water course in an equitable and reasonable manner. So clearly, every state has the right to utilize the water course equitably. And in particular, an international water course shall be used and developed by water course states with a view to attaining optimal and sustainable utilization thereof and benefits therefrom, taking into account the interests of the water course states concerned. So even within the definition of equitable and reasonable use itself, states are required to take into account the interests of other watercourse states. So what does this mean? The ILC, in its commentaries on these draft articles on second reading, has stated that what it means by optimal utilization is attaining maximum possible benefits for all watercourse states and achieving the greatest possible satisfaction for all their needs while minimizing the detriment to and unmet needs of each. So this is quite clear. A watercourse state is entitled to seek beneficial uses of the river, but it must always keep in mind the satisfaction of the needs of other states and minimizing the detriment and harm to other states. So it's an ongoing process, really, to balance equitable use and no harm. It's an ongoing process. And central to that process is taking the scientific studies into consideration and the impact studies. Also, another important point mentioned by the International Law Commission was that the burden of proof for establishing that a particular use is equitable and reasonable lies with the state that is proposing the use that causes significant harm. So these are all issues that need to be taken into account when we talk about a state's equitable right to utilize a river. So my main concern with idealizing or over-idealizing, I would say, the GERD and calling it a major catalyst of cooperation is that are we really overlooking that in trying to develop this new use of the river, there could possibly be harmful effects to other states. Now, obviously, there are a lot of scientific studies that say that there will be a lot more benefits than harms. There are studies that say that we can minimize harm to a large degree. And I'm sure there are studies that say otherwise. And that is the nature of all conflicts on the uses of a watercourse. So if you look at the pulp mills case, for example, before the International Court of Justice, there was a huge, what we call the dueling of the scientists. So each party brought their scientists with their evidence, and they came to the court with thousands of pages of conflicting scientific evidence. And the same thing with, for example, the Indus Water Kishanganga arbitration between Pakistan and India. So the fact is that the science is quite often contested. So I'm not undermining the science. I'm just saying that there is a process, and that process was agreed to by the three states. And they agreed to hire firms, and that these firms would produce impact studies, and that the construction of the GERD would take into consideration the impact studies. So failing to take into consideration these studies in and of itself is a violation of procedure and could possibly be a violation of a substantive obligation. Now, it's too early to be able to judge that because we cannot know whether harm will happen or not, or significant harm will happen or not, until the GERD is actually operational. So it's too early to judge whether a substantive violation has occurred or will occur or not. Now, I don't want to talk for too long about this, but I've just put here on the slide the factors determining equitable and reasonable use. And the reason I put this is because I wanted to shed some light on the fact that a lot of these factors, again, are conflicting. So there's geographic, hydrographic factors. These tend to favor upstream states. There's other factors that tend to favor existing uses. So, for example, E talks about existing and potential uses of the watercourse without favoring one over the other. So potential use and an existing use can both be factors in determining equitable use. Another point, G, is the availability of alternatives of comparative value to a particular planned or existing use. So these are all issues that have to be taken into consideration when we try to consider whether or not a planned use is actually equitable. In terms of procedural obligations, so the UN Watercourses Convention has a series of procedural obligations from Articles 11 to 19, and these provide that a watercourse state is under a duty to consult, exchange information, notify other states before implementing a planned measure. So again, notification is supposed to take place before the implementation of the planned measure. So once Ethiopia had actually started constructing the GERD in 2011 without notifying Egypt and Sudan, although it rectified that subsequently, but in and of itself, that is a violation of procedure. And again, in the Pulp Mills decision, the ICJ said very clearly that it is possible for a state to violate a procedural obligation without ever violating a substantive obligation. So a state doesn't have to cause significant harm to be not compliant with its procedural obligations. And I think if we're going to talk about cooperation in the GERD and in the Nile Basin and future cooperation, I think we should really emphasize and underline the centrality of all of these measures and all of these procedures and all of these substantive obligations that should be respected by all of the parties. So it really is, again, a matter of that negotiations have to be based on good faith, and I've put here an excerpt from the fisheries decision of the ICJ. So the court said, the task before the parties will be to conduct their negotiations on the basis that each must, in good faith, pay reasonable regard to the legal rights of the other, to the facts of the particular situation, and having regard to the interests of other states with established rights. So we're talking here about existing rights, established rights, and having due regard generally to the interests of other states. And it has to be a genuine regard to their interests. Also, this was stated in the Laclanu arbitration, in which the tribunal stated that a state must take into consideration the various interests involved to seek to give them every satisfaction compatible with the pursuit of its own interests, and to show that in this regard it is genuinely concerned to reconcile the interests of the other riparian state with its own. So, having said all of these very general principles,
we just want to have enough time.
I'm going to wrap up. Hello?
Yes, we just want to leave enough time for
I'm going to wrap up. So I'm just going to say these 4 points. International law does not envision the unilateral development of a watercourse, and every state has the right to equitable and reasonable use. So clearly Ethiopia has a right to generate hydropower, but in exercising its equitable use, it must seek to maximize the benefits for all watercourse states and minimize the detriment to each. Where there is a conflict of uses, the ILC has clearly stated that it may be that all reasonable and beneficial uses cannot be realized to their full extent. And then I reached the conclusion from that where there are several different designs, techniques, or modes of operation for a planned use, there is an obligation to implement the one that is least harmful, even if this does not correspond to the optimal or most cost-effective design. And this was emphasized by the tribunal in the Kishinganga arbitration. And so by analogy, considerations related to optimizing energy productivity, minimizing cost, minimizing construction time to start energy production earlier are not justifications to cause harm to another state. So the question that I want to throw to the audience to kind of wrap up is, can a new use that intentionally deprives another state of an existing use, when other alternatives of comparable value are available, be considered equitable and reasonable? And then my final point, when we talk about where to go from here, I think the problem with this issue is there is such a large panoply of legal obligations and rights and instruments and treaties and declarations and statements and customary international law that apply. And my suggestion would be that if the parties, if the 3 states really want an equitable and just solution to this problem, then perhaps they should seek, like other states like India and Pakistan, for example, to resolve this through some form of a judicial settlement or arbitration. So I think maybe if we talk about the future or where we can go from here, perhaps an objective third party would be best able to kind of flesh out these obligations and rights and give them meaning. And just the other fear is that fostering unilateralism, but also the fear that, for example, Dr. Salman had mentioned something about Ethiopia believing that Egypt supports unrest in Ethiopia. Now, for example, that's one thing that the Egyptians have been vehemently denying. So if that is used as a justification to release Ethiopia of its obligations under the DOP, then we're back to square one, because there is no cooperative framework anymore. So really, when we think about where to go from here, it has to be to build trust, it has to be to build cooperation based on genuine good faith negotiations, it has to be to make sure that the process is genuinely followed and that the studies are respected, and really, I would say that some kind of neutral, objective arbiter in the process would add a lot to it. Thank you very, very much.
Excellent. Thank you for that presentation. And I think that really fit in nicely with some of the other discussions we've been having here today. So good to have that thought. I'd like to remind everyone, all of our audience members, that we're accepting a few questions. We're going to try to extend the length of the webinar a little bit, considering some of our presenters have gone a little bit over the 10 minutes, leaving us with less time here. And we will be addressing those right after the final presentation. You can just go to the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. It's about halfway down. Type your question, I'll see it, and I will direct it to our audience. Let's move on now to our final presenter, Marcella Nanni. And there we go. We have the...
Okay, now.
There we go. Excellent.
Okay, this presentation, well, first of all, good afternoon, well, good evening to everybody. This last presentation focuses on a topic which is somehow, well, it is related. Someone may think it's out of context, but in reality, it's related to a Nile Basin cooperation. Some preliminary questions, in fact. Will GERD cooperation or cooperation on the Nile Basin influence cooperation in water resources management in the IGAD region? And also another question that arises from the former. Will IGAD regional cooperation influence decisions leading to the entry into force of the CFA? First of all, though, we have to ask, what is IGAD? IGAD was born as Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Development, IGAD with double D, in 1986 to deal with drought-related problems affecting the Greater Horn of Africa. In 1996, it changed name into Intergovernmental Authority on Development, so it dropped one D, with a mandate which became broader. In fact, this mandate would cover food security, environment, the maintenance of peace and security in the region, humanitarian affairs, and economic cooperation and integration. Thus, IGAD is indeed a regional integration organization. The member countries are Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Uganda. Eritrea suspended participation in IGAD. And basically all member states of IGAD are Nile Basin states, except for Djibouti and Somalia. IGAD is endowed with a lot of transboundary water resources. Besides the Nile, which is probably the most important, we have the Omo-Turkana Basin, we have the Juba and the Shebelle basins, we have the Awash, and as far as transboundary aquifers are concerned, the most important of them is the Nubian sandstone aquifer, part of which underlies Sudan. Then we have other aquifers like the Merti aquifer, Mount Elgon, the Sad, the Rift Valley aquifer. IGAD in the years 2000 decided to put water on its agenda. And this why? Because the IGAD region is quite large, and water is to be found in some countries, but not in others. So, in fact, over 60% of the region is arid or hyper-arid. The countries have different levels of socioeconomic development and different national approaches to water resources management given the climate. while water is really recognized as indispensable for development. The countries are at different stages of development of their respective national policy, legal and institutional frameworks. Some of the countries have comprehensive water laws, such as Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, also Djibouti, also Sudan. Some of them are out of date. Some other countries do not have comprehensive water laws. In particular, Somalia, given its own situation, has legislation which is scattered in texts which stems back to the 70s. South Sudan, being a new country, has only recently embarked in drafting a new water law, which is now being discussed and considered. Somalia also has a new water law, which is being considered by the government. So there are differences in approaches, and then of course each country has its own national interests with regard to water resources development. Therefore, there has been a recognition that a common approach to water resources management is needed. And IGAD has started thinking of the need for a regional policy and legal framework, so that in 2012 it started a regional program, the Inland Water Resources Management Program, which lasted until beginning 2015. Now another question is to be asked, does IGAD have the mandate to deal with water resources? And the answer is yes, because the agreement on the establishment of IGAD of 1996 states clearly at Article 13.a that member states have a duty to cooperate in, among other things, the sustainable management and utilization of shared natural resources, while Article 17 empowers member states to conclude protocols for the implementation of the agreement. So the IGAD Inland Water Resources Management Program embarked one of its components, because the program had a legal component, on the development of a regional water resources policy, which was endorsed in 2015, and after the endorsement of a policy, of a draft regional water resources protocol in the form of a working document. The program ended up in 2015, but the document, the draft regional protocol is has been taken over, discussed, and is currently being negotiated. Now, what was the development process for arriving at the regional policy and development at the document, the working document containing the draft protocol? First of all, there was the approach taken was bottom up, starting from national consultations and regional workshops. Secondly, IGAD decided not to interfere with programs and projects within the umbrella of the Nile Basin Initiative, because these programs and projects were well underway, and of course the CFA was already in place. But of course it chose to be informed by Nile Basin Cooperation and by the CFA in particular, because the CFA, although it's not in force, has been the result of lengthy and constructive debates, so that lessons could be drawn from these debates. The process has also been informed, of course, by IGAD strategic documents, and of course by regional frameworks within Africa, in particular the SADC framework, because SADC has a policy, a regional policy, and of course there's a SADC revised protocol, and the regional framework at the level of the East African community. And of course, as far as legal instruments are concerned, work was based on also the UN Watercourses Convention and the draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers. The UN Watercourses Convention, of course, has informed the CFA, therefore much thought has been given to maintaining, to not reinventing the wheel, and using the principles enshrined in the convention and in the CFA as basic principles of both the policy and the draft protocol. Other international legal instruments have been also considered, together with the situation on the ground. And of course, the protocol, the draft protocol, has been informed by the policy. The regional water resources policy follows the outline of other policy instruments, and in particular of SADC regional water policy. So I'm not repeating, I'm not going to discuss what's in the policy, because it reflects what's in the SADC policy. The working document, the draft regional protocol, has as overall objectives, you see the regional protocol basically is meant to be an umbrella under which specific river basin and aquifer agreements are expected to be formulated and negotiated. The objective of the protocol is to foster cooperation. Specific objectives focus on the protocol being a basis for the agreements and institutional arrangements that will come. The protocol aims also at promoting the harmonization of policies and legislation, and promoting research, technological development, awareness, and capacity building. The content, well, the content in brief, again, I will repeat, no intention was that to reinvent the wheel. So the draft protocol contains substantive rules derived from the UN Watercourses Convention, therefore equitable and reasonable utilization, the obligation not to cause significant harm, and the general obligation to cooperate have been are the subject of provisions, of the main provisions of the protocol. Procedural rules also reflect the procedural rules which are enshrined in the UN Watercourses Convention. Provisions relate to exchange of information and to the notification of planned measures. The protocol also promotes an ecosystem approach that it deals with transboundary water resources and related ecosystems. There are provisions on water resources monitoring which are not to be found in the UN Watercourses Convention, but are found elsewhere. We may mention the UNECE Water Convention, which is now of which the 2003 amendment has entered into force, that allows UN member states outside the UNECE region to become members, become parties. And important provisions concern the institutional arrangements, which are similar to those adopted by the SADC. There are institutional arrangements at the IGAD level and at the basin level in the form of basin or aquifer commissions, committees, authorities. There are provisions on public participation, provisions on transboundary EIA, and a specific statement of an explicit duty to harmonize policies, legislation, and plans. So it's in line with prevailing international law, in line with the UN Water Courses Convention, but considers issues in the region and the situation on the ground. In brief, the institutional setup for water resources at the IGAD level consists of a ministerial council on water resources composed of ministers in charge of water affairs of the member states, which is the apex body, the overall making body. There's a regional technical advisory committee, which is basically the successor of the TAC, a technical advisory committee which was set up to steer the inland water resources management program implementation, which is the technical arm which informs the Council of Ministers, screens the work done at the level of the water unit of IGAD, which has been established at the IGAD Secretariat. And there are national focal points. Now, I believe that this effort on the part of IGAD will, of course, it's very early to tell, but will influence Nile Basin cooperation and possibly will accelerate decisions relating to the entry into force of the CFA. In turn, this IGAD legal framework, new regional framework, will be influenced by cooperation on the GERD. So the regional policy.
We can kind of move towards the point, the finale here. Let's give us enough time to have some questions at the end.
Yes, which will inform river basin and aquifer agreements, and also national policy and legal frameworks, which will need to be harmonized. This is all. I think I have exhausted the.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. That was a great presentation and a really different direction to take things, and I think a nice way to sort of end the sessions of presentations on our webinar. So if anyone has questions, we have one question here, and I can relate that. And then if there's a few other questions, we can try to address them. But we do need to wrap up the webinar pretty soon, as we are moving just a little bit over time. The first question is, can we say if it is too early to judge if the GERD has had harmful impacts to states? Or when can we fairly say that harmful impacts have been achieved, and what is the threshold for that, I guess?
We were not able to hear the question, Scott.
Can you repeat?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Is it too early to judge if there have been or will be harmful impacts as a result of the dam? And what is the threshold for judging these harmful impacts?
To Sudan or to Egypt or to both?
The question asker did not specify one country, but I assume they mean downstream riparians. Yes.
I can attempt to reply that. Well, I think it's always too soon to take conclusions about anything we talk about. It's a moving target. I mean, the dam is not even completed. The filling has not started this year, as a lot of people have expected. It might start next year, not around this time, but a bit earlier than this time. But that also depends on the rainfall levels. So if we talk about impacts in the sense of what can really change the water flows, the water allocations, I think that's definitely too early know. If we talk about economic impacts, and I think Ken's presentation was very good on that, and I think it would be good that we have more research done on this field, the economic impacts that this can have, both positive and negative, that projects such as this one can have in the different economies and in the regional economy. But I think most important than all, and perhaps this is what the question is trying to address, is the political risks, because we might have a lot of economic benefits for all the countries, and there will be still a political risk. And we know that in the case of Egypt, which is the country more concerned about what is going on for for many reasons, but one is that it's the main user, the current main user of the Nile water resources, is that it's of course very important to know which political risks are involved. And I think this cannot be ignored. It's obviously that it cannot be ignored, and this goes well beyond any kind of agreements that can be found and implemented, and even if we have all the compliance mechanisms in place, this is about political trust, and this can only be built not by the researchers, not by the academics, but by the politicians themselves, with the help, of course, of informed information being provided to the public, to the technical people, although I think the technical people are the ones that really need less awareness of this. So I think impacts is already having positive ones, I would say. I mean, the countries are now collaborating more and committing to more than they had under the NBI, and this says quite a lot. Is it because the countries are negotiating trilaterally and then it's easier to come to an agreement, or is it because countries are now really going into the details of the cooperation process? And I stop here. Sorry, Scott. I should have been more brief.
Can I? Sorry, does Dr. Salman want to go first?
It's okay. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to support what Anna just said, because all of these studies are about potential impact. So it's potential adverse impacts or potential beneficial impacts. So the studies essentially are about potentialities in the future. So when we talk about whether or not harm has happened, that really is something that we will be able to assess once the dam is in operation, or at least once we know what the filling period is and what all the details are that are agreed on. So that's something for a later stage. But for the procedural obligations, I think it is quite clear that the procedural obligations take place in tandem with construction. So you can say when a certain procedure has been overlooked or has not been complied with. So in terms of the substantive obligations, I think we'll have to wait a little bit before we can really pass assessment on that. And maybe I just want to pick up on something else Anna said, that the cooperative climate is extremely important. Dr. Salman had mentioned that Egypt threatened to attack the dam in 2013. And I think that was an embarrassment for a lot of Egyptians also. So, so it really was a very bad situation, a very bad point, I guess, in Egypt's very recent history. And what has happened is that now there's a new government, new regime, and there is a lot more desire to cooperate, and that in itself is very brave. There is a very strong commitment towards the cooperative process. And as Anna said, there are, of course, political costs to that, because the issue of the Nile waters, there's a very strong nationalist sentiment attached to that, as in Ethiopia. So the fact that the countries are coming together and cooperating is definitely something to be encouraged. But I would say to be encouraged further in a more genuine manner.
Salman, would you like to speak?
Yes, I would like to. I tend to agree with the points raised by Anna and Jasmine, that we're talking about potential impact, that the real impact has not yet shown up because Ethiopia has not yet started filling the reservoir. But I want to make 2 points on this connection. The first thing is that we tend to talk about the Nile flow as 84 billion cubic meters. This figure came up in the 1959 agreement, and we continue to use it. The fact is that the Nile flow has increased tremendously in the last couple of years. A UNDP study, and a published study by UNDP, put the average from 1960 to 2009 as 109 billion cubic meters. That's about 25 billion cubic meters more than what is being used by most of the people who write about the Nile. So from 84, we're talking about 109. This is a UNDP study, and it's a published study. It's in the, so this is because, I think part of it is because the uncertainty in the Ethiopian plateau, climate change, and the uncertainty in the Nile. So we could end up with a situation where we have the Nile flowing at 109 or 116 or 125 as happened in the 60s, which will mean that the reservoir could be filled quickly and easily and without really any negative impact on Sudan and Egypt. The second thing, which keeps to be completely absent in the discussion about the GERD, is the fact that Egypt managed to fill the reservoir of the Aswan High Dam, which is 162 billion cubic meters. That's more than twice the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam reservoir, which is 74 billion. How did Egypt do that without having negative effects on the farmers and irrigation in Egypt? And I think they did it because of the high flow of the Nile at that time. They themselves were surprised by the amount of water that the Nile carried in those years. And we could see that in the submergence of the Sudanese territory, which happened so quickly that it even forced the director of the immigration to move before the time because of the submergence of the area happened earlier than expected. So we are dealing with really a number of factors that are not, we don't know what will happen in the next 2, 3, 4 years when the reservoir will happen. And so I tend to agree with Anna and Jasmine that we are really talking about potential, and while in reality there may be very little negative impact on Sudan and Egypt, especially given the fact that was repeated by one of the speakers that Sudan is not using its full share of the Nile waters and in the Nile 1959 agreement. They're using only 12, and 6.5 have been going to Egypt since 59. So assuming that, so there will be very little impact on Sudan, and even if the situation doesn't change to the high flow, and if there is a high flow, there may even be no impact on Sudan and very little impact on Egypt.
That's very good. In our next question, I'm going to also make this in lieu of sort of a wrap up once around for everyone to have a final chance to make a comment. And this is to ask, whose responsibility, or is it everybody's responsibility, to take the initiative for cooperation right now? We're at an interesting junction of time, interesting place for the future. So who has the responsibility to take us into the next step? And we can just go in whichever order, but this will be our final question. Sorry, we don't have more time for more questions. I know there's 1 or 2 left, but it's just kind of the situation. We're out of time. Thank you. Who'd like to go?
Anna, you want to jump in, Anna? Anna, you want to start?
Yes, I can start. Well, we are talking about a very high-level political process, and I think we cannot escape from that. We can try to influence as much as possible in our own, I would say, professional and personal capacities. What we have been trying to do, when I say we, but as well the group of people that we have joined in this special issue, what we have been trying to do is to invite as always as possible, or as often as possible, the decision makers to join the kind of things that we do. I mean, it's this idea that it's not just the public that needs to inform. The decision makers themselves can be exposed to this kind of academic topics. Of course, that's perhaps we need to tune the message according to who we have in front of us. But I think the cooperation is there. I mean, might not be the ideal one, but countries are sitting down and talking in particular about the GERD. As we speak, they might be meeting somewhere and having some trilateral negotiations. So I suppose that we can have value, but we cannot replace the type of negotiations that are going on. This is my brief reply.
Thank you.
Jasmine, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'm thinking a lot about it because it's difficult to really kind of point fingers and say who should take an initiative. Clearly, all three states must have in mind that they want the cooperative process to succeed and that they want to take it a step further. I would say it would go a very long way in terms of confidence building and in terms of implementing the Declaration of Principles if Ethiopia were to slow down the rate of construction in order to make sure that the results of the studies can be taken into consideration. So the studies are going to take still a number of months before they are ready. And I believe that's a good starting point because that's what the three countries agreed to. So there could be, halting or slowing down construction to take those studies into consideration. Having said that, I believe all three states and policymakers in all three states have to really kind of realize that the future in the Nile Basin is to cooperate and to find as many cooperative mechanisms as possible. And I think the Declaration of Principles is a good starting point.
Yeah, I think I really don't have much to add to what Anna and Jasmine said. That the ball is rolling. It may not be rolling as quickly as and effectively and efficiently as one would have hoped, but it is moving. And I think now there is a role for facilitators, outside facilitators, to keep the parties moving, talking, and discussing those issues and to help them. And the World Bank and UNDP in the past did a good job by spearheading the Nile Basin Initiative. Recently, the bank called for a meeting for the three countries, and they met in Washington here, and I think that was last month. Yes, it was last month. The three ministers of water resources came to Washington at the invitation of the World Bank. They continue to talk. And I should also point to the work that's being done by SIWI. Anna is leading that work, and I think that's a great facilitation. It's also bringing the officials and the experts from the three countries, and it's filling a large vacuum that was left by the World Bank, UNDP, and the other donors. So Anna, keep the good work.
Thank you.
The world is looking at you.
Big responsibility, eh?
Marcella, would you have any final comments?
I think that's the end of this.
I fully support what Anna and Salman were saying, and of course it's a long process, and well, I think that it would be having an influence elsewhere. Well, without focusing in particular on the IGAD region, because there, of course, it will have some impact, but also elsewhere in the continent. So, the question as to who should start taking the initiative for further steps, for further cooperation remains open. I mean, it's all the states that may take that initiative.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that comment. I'd like to thank all my panel again, everyone for joining us and everyone for sticking around a little bit longer to answer a few questions. Appreciate all your time you shared with us, especially those who have presented twice today. This has been quite a discussion about the GERD. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for sticking around and for asking questions and really helping us keep this conversation going and giving a lot of energy. I think we had a lot of really great thoughts about the GERD and water governance today. I want to remind everybody, all of our audience members, that the webinar itself is based on the special issue of our flagship publication, Water International, and that we will have a forthcoming policy briefing for people who want to distill the essence of the hundreds and hundreds of pages down to just 3 or 4 pages. for those who are a little bit pressed for time. And all of this will be available on our website, along with the PowerPoint presentations and recordings of the webinar at www.iwra.org very soon. So on behalf of the whole IWRA staff, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. Just to remind you that we are a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization with a focus on connecting disciplines and geographies and professionals and ways that are helping to make us reconceptualize and re-understand how to connect with sustainable use of the world's water resources. And that we are, in fact, a membership-based organization. So if you like what you've heard today, please go to our website and become a member. I'll give you access to all these webinars, to copies of Water International, and puts you in a good position to go to our World Water Congress, our forthcoming Congress on water issues, all water issues, which has its abstracts are now open. So if you're interested in submitting an abstract, please go to our website. It'll be in Cancun in 2017. So could hopefully see you there. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we will hopefully be seeing you again soon at our next webinar. Thank you to everybody. Have a good
Scott, for
day
organizing
or whatever time.
moderating.
Take care.
Thank you.